All right, you can all sit down now. That was... All right, will you all be seated now so I can introduce our speakers? We are very grateful to Alan Stang for pinch hitting and introducing his very dear friend. And I'm not going to tell you anything about Alan Stang because 99% of the people here know, well, some of the people here know about Alan Stang. I'm going to let Alan Stang take 10 minutes to tell a little about himself and what he's doing, and then, well, 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes to introduce Charlie Smith. Thank you.
Take 3 minutes. Charlie says I should only take 3 minutes. Well, you know, ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me that just about every speech that we've heard here is really what Richard Nixon is doing. He really is the central figure in so many of the problems that we have in our country today. And, you know, speaking of Richard Nixon reminds me of the story of the 4 elderly gentlemen who were traveling in a railway coach somewhere in England. They began to talk among themselves, and they discovered they were all retired military men. So one of them came up with the idea. He said, well, why don't we all get up and introduce ourselves and tell a little bit about ourselves so we'll know something about the outfits that we served in. They thought it was a good idea, so the first one stood up. He said, Higginbottom's the name, retired brigadier, married Lord Faversham's daughter, 2 sons, both in the clergy. He sat down. The next guy got up. He said, Faversham's the name, retired brigadier, married Lord Pinkney's daughter, 2 sons, both Harley Street physicians. He sat down. The next guy got up. He said, Pinkley's the name, retired brigadier, married Lord Plimpton Bottom's daughter, 2 sons, both in Parliament. He sat down. The last guy got up. He said, Sykes the name, retired sergeant major, never married, 2 sons, both brigadiers. Well, as you heard, ladies and gentlemen, Governor Maddox unfortunately could not be here, so we've specially selected a guest speaker for you because he has so much in common with Governor Maddox. Now, I just want to prove that nothing that happens here is accidental or haphazard. The reason we've so carefully thought this out, this next event, is, you know, we've been taking a lot of flack in the press, as usual, here, you know, on the Boston Globe, for example, if you ladies will pardon my language. And they discovered that, you know, they discovered Gary Allen as an anti-Semite, and his book is anti-Semitic, for example, and, you know, we're an anti-Negro operation. So I'm sure the Boston Globe is here now. You can report that there are no white Protestants up here, at least, I mean, during this next event. No. Our speaker calls his talk, he just told me, he calls it getting even. Getting even. I don't know exactly what he means by that. He's going to tell us. I'm not worried about it. Maybe you white folks are. Our speaker comes from Santa Barbara, California, and he is the editor of the Voice of Watts newsletter. Watts, of course, is the famous area in downtown Los Angeles in which the revolutionaries conducted one of their first spontaneous riots 7 years ago. Our speaker is also a speaker very much in demand for the American Opinion Speakers Bureau. He travels around the country on extended speaking tours. Just last Monday it was, a week ago tonight, we were in New York and we taped the David Susskind show. And I'm happy to be able to tell you that our speaker just about single-handedly decimated good old David. Now, our speaker has a very interesting background. He years ago was a member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. That, as you know, was a communist revolutionary organization, the purpose of which was to spew out a lot of propaganda throughout the United States to defend Castro and to help Castro in the period in which he was consolidating his dictatorship. So our speaker, like so many of us, was simply another victim who had been conned and fooled and tricked into participating in this revolutionary movement. Then, as he tells it, one day his wife came in and said, "Look, dummy, here's what you're doing." And after she explained to him what this was really all about, he began to realize and began to look into it a little further. He also claims that he has the distinction of being the only member of the John Birch Society ever to have picketed Robert Welch. Once again, we've selected our speaker very carefully because he does have so much in common with Governor Maddox, and I say that not jokingly now, because they both are fighting to defend our way of life, our American way of life. And I think along those lines, one very important point should be made. You know, a lot of people, they say, and I'm sure many of you, some of you at least have said this yourselves, you know, why can't we get more Negro members? We're doing everything we can. Why can't we get more Negro members? We're working day and night, but we just can't seem to break through. You may not be aware, some of you I'm sure are, that the Negro population in the United States, at this point at least, is being terrorized in a way that the white population has not been subjected to, at least so far. The white people are being terrorized by propaganda, by such terrifying threats as Walter Cronkite, things like this. But so far, at least, the white people have not been subjected to generalized mass terror. And in many of the Negro neighborhoods across the United States, you'll find that that is what is going on. The Negro people are being terrorized. It's worse than Saigon, downtown Saigon, in many of these Negro neighborhoods in one city after another across the country. Anybody who stands up and speaks out in one of these neighborhoods will get a call from or a visit from such communist terror gangs as the Black Panthers, for example. I mean, this is the way it works. So when you get somebody to stand up in a Negro neighborhood, you have somebody who is a hero, a real hero, who is standing up against this type of physical terror, which we now see going on in the Negro neighborhoods. It's one of the great untold stories that the press has not been telling us about what goes on in these neighborhoods. This is why it's so difficult, has been so difficult to get more Negro members, because of what they are up against. Nevertheless, we are beginning to get more Negro members, more of these heroes, real heroes, I believe, and one of them is my very good friend who's going to speak to you now, Mr. Charles Smith of Santa Barbara, California.
Come back here, Alan. Thank you. I won't have to get even with you now. Thank you. This talk is entitled Getting Even. And as you saw me writing right there, I had in mind to get even with Alan Stang. Then he said some nice things about me. I took it off. He said some nasty things. I wrote him back. You better behave during your talk. This seems like the gloom and doom society here. We found out how bad off we are. Well, what I'm going to talk about is some of my experiences on the road, and I do call it getting even because I've gotten even with a lot of people, and I got a lot more to get even with. But before I even begin getting even, I have an announcement to make. I have two announcements, actually, and I think this announcement is crucial. The other announcement will be made at the end of the talk. This announcement, I think, has an impact, and it's something which all of you need to know. I am totally opposed to forced busing. The reason I say that is because I was down south once, or several times. I'm crazy to go down and back and down and back, you know. But I was down there speaking for a large audience, and one woman jumped up. I'd given a talk, and she jumped up and said to me, she said, "Mr. Smith, where do you stand on forced busing?" Well, if she had heard the talk, she would know I was against forced busing. So I looked at her and I says, "Miss," I said, "let me tell you right now, I am totally opposed to forced busing." Then I paused a minute. "Do you think I want my kids to go to school with white kids?" Well, of course, you have to defuse those bombs. Well, I was getting even with somebody during that time because people throw this race business up all the time and they get us to take sides. What's happening with schools, of course, should be obvious to everybody. The communists have put this on the basis of race. The issue, of course, is government control of schools, the government taking control of schools and children, which is the 10th plank of Marx's manifesto, have the government control all children. This is the dream of demagogues everywhere. But what's happening here is they're getting us to fight on race. Like a bunch of fools, you and I are fighting each other, and while we're fighting each other, somebody's trotting off with our kids. This is what's going on, of course, and so I was getting even with somebody at that time. I'm a salesman. I didn't know it, but I'm a salesman. I've never sold anything, but I'm told that I can sell. What happened was I was up in Northern California once, and I went to this radio station, and there were several, TV station actually, for an interview. There was a newsman there. He was a flaming liberal. As a matter of fact, the president of the station had brought this man out specifically to interview me. You know, John Bircher and all that means, you know, that sort of business. Terrible guy. Well, the newsman came out. He had a big sheath of papers, all kind of questions on it, all kind of nonsense. And we had about 10 minutes before the talk actually began, before I was going to be interviewed. They were setting up the cameras, and I sat him down, and I said, "Wait a minute, now look." I said, "Let me talk to you a bit." I said, "There's no sense in me fighting you." He said, "I'm not going to fight you." I said, "Let me ask you a question. Do you want dictatorship in any form?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, neither do I." I then described the characteristics of dictatorship. And at each point of the description, he said he didn't want that, and neither did I. I got to the gun registration, gun confiscation. He didn't want it, neither did I. And so I told him, I said, "Now look, there are some people in this country who want dictatorship. Why should we fight each other when someone's putting us both in slavery?" What happened, of course, was that when the interview came, he scrapped the questions, laid them aside. I was his friend. And he asked me some nice questions, and I socked it to him. Two lefties out there. Got finished, and I wrapped up my stuff. This newsman, incidentally, wanted the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, the politician. So when it was over, I promised to get those things for him. So I was leaving. And as I walked by the owner of the station, he said to me, he said, "Shh, shh." So I looked, he said, "Come in here a minute. I want to talk to you." So I don't know, I went in his office. I said, "What do you want?" He said, "Sit down." So I sat down. He says, "Look," he says, "you want a job?" I said, "Do I want a job?" I said, "Doing what?" "I don't know anything about television." He said, "Selling ads." I said, "Selling ads? What makes you think I can sell ads?" And he said to me, he says, "You sold that guy to John Birch Society. You can sell anybody anything." Now, I have to cross these off as I go because this is kind of a spontaneous thing. I simply wrote down some notes here, so I have to sort of keep track of it. But I used to have an awful lot of fun with race, and I think we should have some fun with that. I mean, really, there's nothing wrong with race, mine. I think we should have some fun with it. As an example, I used to work at Lockheed, and I worked with a lot of white guys at Lockheed. We were good friends. We used to tell all kind of jokes, and this is all before that civil rights stuff got so bad, you know? So when people could just talk back and forth. Well, what was happening was that this white friend of mine, who was a real good friend, ran up to me one day. I had this Negro friend standing there with me. We were talking, and this white guy says, "Hey, you two guys are going to get fired." I says, "What are you talking about, Bob?" He says, you're going to get fired. You're not doing your job." You must be insane. He says, I just come from the foreman, and you two guys are going to get fired for not doing your job. I says, well, what are you talking about? He says, you're not following instructions. He says, lay on the floor so you won't get fired. Lay on the floor? So where do you get that stuff from? He says, it's right here in the book. You see here? It says, lay the jig down. For those who don't know what a jig is, of course, that's just another name. Something happened in the 1964 campaign, and this is part of getting even. See, I got a lot of people to get even with out there. I wish they were here so I could throw this Molotov cocktail I got in my pocket. I got a lot of people to get even with. During the 1964 campaign, I was working for Goldwater, and the funniest cartoon I saw, and again, this is something you sort of have to enjoy if you appreciate situations. The funniest cartoon I saw was in a Negro newspaper. There was a woman there who was a rabid racist, a rabid anti-Semite, and she had this cartoon. And it was of me and a friend and a third party. What it really showed there was Barry Goldwater, you know, the caricature of him. He was standing there, and right in front of him was a Negro who must have been at least 95 years old. He was all broken down. He had a cane and all bent over, almost down to his knees, you know, big beard and everything. And Goldwater was saying to him, Tom, by God, Tom, I thought you was dead. That was a subtle way of getting at us, so I got to get even with them. I used to believe in race wars. I honestly did. One time I was out promoting this sort of business, and then one day I began to look at the odds. Now, that's not as far as it went. Consider what happened. I thought to myself, let's just suppose that all the Negroes get guns. Let's suppose that. And all of us start shooting. Okay? Now, naturally, all the white folks get guns and all y'all start shooting. Now, what do we have on our side? Well, we've got 10% of the population. Y'all got 90. In addition to that, you got all the planes, all the tanks, all the H-bombs, A-bombs. You even got some poison gas that'll make your feet hurt. And you think we're so crazy we're going to start a race war. The point is, you see, that a lot of people have been tricked into believing that the white people can win a race war. And this, of course, is, well, you really can't. You know, no, you've been tricked into believing that you can win a race war. Because once you begin believing that, you'll lose sight of the fact that when Americans fight Americans, Americans lose. You can't win. Well, now, let me move up to my orientation. We have to go to the state of Washington for this sort of thing. You know, Washington was a nice little place. People got along pretty good up there, and then they shipped in a bunch of Negroes from the West Coast. I mean, from the East Coast, and then they went up there and started raising all kinds of cane, having trouble. Well, I spoke up there to a black students' union. Now, you can imagine what it was like. You have to envision this. A bunch of gurus, like 1,000 Black Panthers sitting there, and there I was supposed to speak to these people. Well, there were also some white people there. Some of them had beards. And then there were some Mormon types, you know, like didn't know anything about what was going on, just sort of sitting there like innocent. Well, I got given a talk, and I finished the talk, and this one Negro got up, or he called himself a black. See, they call themselves blacks. They call me a Negro. Supposed to be a bad word. This one so-called black got up, and he said, Mr. Smith. He called me some more names. And then he said, you say there's a conspiracy against the Negroes. I say, yeah, it sure is. A conspiracy using Negroes. I said, yeah, there sure is. He said, well, answer this one question. Why is it that with all the black leaders and all the black politicians, the black PhDs, the black doctors, the black lawyers, the black intellectuals, why is it that with all of these black leaders, out of them, you're the only black? Then he stopped. He said, you're not even a black, you're a Negro. Why is it that you, a Negro, are the only one who can see this conspiracy. Well, I was on the spot, so I leaned up on the podium and I said to him, I said, well, I hate to tell you this, but I'm smarter than the rest of them. Then I told him I was going to prove it. The other guys are crazy. I said, you getting pushed into adopting socialism, you don't know what you're talking about. I said, for instance, most of you guys are in favor of the Black Manifesto and what James Forman demanded. Remember the Black Manifesto, written by the National Council of Churches and palmed off on the Negroes like it's written by Negroes. Of course, it's written by them. But I told them, I said, that thing was promoting socialism. So they accused me of being a liar. So I said, now, wait a minute. Now, let me ask you a question. How many of you guys out there, how many of you have actually read the Black Manifesto? Up went a bunch of hands. So I looked at him. I said, you mean to tell me you've read the Black Manifesto? You read the whole thing? You didn't read a little excerpt, not what they said on the news, but you read the whole thing, every page. And as I hammered at this reading every page business and reading the whole thing, the hands began to come down one by one. Finally, I looked over and there was only one guy with his hand up, and this was a white guy with a beard. He was one of the teachers. And I said, now you, are you sure you read the Black Manifesto? He said, which one? So you know what I did, of course. I sat him down, and then I pulled out that little sheet of paper. It's only 4 pages long, and showed him the Black Manifesto. And then I told him, like I said, I'm smarter than the rest of you. In the John Birch Society, I told him, now mine's in a state of shock at this time. In the John Birch Society, we publish such things because we want you to read them. We want you to find out the origin of it, of course. And if enough people read that material, understand what's going on, and do the thinking for themselves, they won't get in trouble. When I say think for yourself, I mean that. As a matter of fact, I ran into a white guy one time who wasn't thinking for himself. I was up in Washington State. Yes, of course, I was having a debate up there, and what was happening was that I was supposed to debate the United Nations with this fellow, or excuse me, not the UN. I was supposed to debate communism, as to whether or not communism was monolithic or whether it was all fragmented and all this business. They didn't tell me which side to take. It just supposed to be a debate. So I figured out the other guy was a lefty. He was from the United Nations Association, from this United World Federalists and all that stuff. So I knew which side he would take, that communism was weak and mellowing, and this sort of business, and it was all fragmented. Nobody controlled it. So I took the opposite view. What happened there was that I gave my talk first, and he gave his talk. And the first day I sort of ripped him up. We had 2 debates, actually. We come back for the second debate, and he was ready for me. I had planted some questions in the audience. And I had told these people, I said, now look, I don't care what he says. I don't care what happens. When the question and answer period starts, you get your hands up. And they agreed to do that. Lo and behold, I gave my talk, he gave his talk. Came the question and answer period. Well, my opponent had gotten up and he says, I realize that my opponent has planted questions in the audience. A dirty trick. So come the question and answer period, all the Birchers kept their hands down, and up went his buddies. They had all their questions. Well, you know what happened, of course, is the one kid got up, he was a teenager, he was reading. He says, Mr. Smith, how do you expect us to believe you? He couldn't read very well. The gist of his question was, how did I expect the students to believe me when all I had done was give them a talk, whereas my opponent had quoted Life, Look, Time, Newsweek, Barry Goldwater. They quoted Nixon and Jackson and the whole crowd on communism. He said, how do you expect us to believe you when you haven't given us any sources? Well, I was on the spot again. So I said, well, I said, son, you see, it's like this. When God put man on earth, he gave him a brain and told him to use it. He did not give him a copy of the New York Times and tell him to quote it. I know you think I'm kidding, but this happened out there. And like I say, I'm slick. I can find my pen. You got a pen, Alan? Oh, here it is. No, you get in these traps, and you have to find a way to get out, you know, and you got to do some fancy footwork and head work, because these guys will kill you. Let me tell you how I got even with a coordinator. This is a paid employee of the John Birch Society. You see, I didn't really want to get even with him, but he had done me a dirty turn. What happened was that I was up in the state of Washington, and it seems like a lot of stuff was happening in Washington. I understand that Lenin and Trotsky had a meeting up there a few years ago. I don't know, but I think they did. I was up in the state of Washington, and I was invited to speak at this college. Well, that's kind of a unique honor, trying to get me out there and rip me up a little bit. So I said, all right, I'll do it. And on the way up, this coordinator was explaining to me what the situation was. This was Black Studies Week. You know, it used to be Negro History Week or something. And they turned it all over to the Black Students Union. Well, you know what that was going to be like. I felt like they were pitching me to the wolves. And he was telling me, oh, he said, them Black Panthers are going to rip you up. See? Oh, he was just having his joy. He was happier than heck, you know, and he was describing to me how much trouble I was going to be in, how all these gurus are going to get me. And I was really worried. I honestly was, because Dick Gregory had spoken in the night before. And they were primed, ready for this John Bircher. Well, I'm kind of tricky, you see, and like I explained before about that being smarter than the rest of them business, I sort of tripped them up and got them all off balance. So I had the thing completely under control. There was no chance, no danger at all, that anybody was going to start any trouble. The only problem was that the coordinator didn't know that. See, he was kind of scared, and he had sat about halfway back, and he was sitting there with a tape recorder and sort of hiding in amongst the crowd. See, there were some white people there, too, and he was making like one of them. Well, one of these fellows got up, and this was a white fellow, incidentally. He says, I want to know why you called Martin Luther King a communist. I said, when? He said, in that film. I saw a film from the John Birch Society. It called Martin Luther King a communist. I said, oh, I never. You mean a member of the party? Yeah. I says, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I've seen all of Birch films. I've never seen any film that documented or said that King was a member of the Communist Party. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, he didn't know the name of it, the film, but he was so insistent that a film existed that I saw my chance to get even. I said, I'll tell you something now. I've seen all the films, but I've been traveling around, and maybe there's a film come out recently that I haven't seen. Now, I don't know, I said, but I think I do know who knows. I said, you see, there's a coordinator, a paid employee at the John Birch Society sitting right back there. There he is. Everybody looked around, and the coordinator looked around, too. For those who want to know who he was, this was Bob Bogensberger, who dreamed up Project Win. He's a pretty good guy. I said, stand up, Bob. Now, if you know how tall he is, he must be about 6'7" or so. I said, stand up, Bob. And he was down in his seat, something terrible. And I was, all the time I was saying this, I was thinking about them Black Panthers gonna rip me up, huh? I said, stand up, Bob. There he is. And I kept pointing him out, and finally old Bob stood up, you know, and his knees was trembling. He knew he'd been had. And I said to him, you know anything about that film? He opened his mouth and said, dabba, 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 dabba. I have had no trouble with him since. I should tell you about the Chinaman who came here, and this is by way of getting even again, I say to you guys right now, I look at you and you all look alike. Well, you see, what happened there was that I remember this Chinaman came over here, and he was entertained by the media, taking around, showing all the White House, showing everything. And he had this grand tour of the United States. He even saw Disneyland. When it was all over, he was leaving. As he was leaving, these newsmen crowded around him for some profound statement. It was not a great guru or something, just an ordinary Chinaman. And they crowded around him for some profound statement. They were milking him for all he's worth. And finally, one of the men said to him, before you leave, is there anything you notice about the American people? Anything at all, which you would notice as a Chinaman, but which other people wouldn't notice? Something we can pass on to history and tell our children as an original observation. And the Chinaman said, yeah, it's the funny way their eyes slant. So I said, oh, you guys look the same. Now that's about the same story as the Negro on the bus up in upstate New York. Lived in a white neighborhood, or almost all white neighborhood. And he was sitting on the bus, and no one on the bus but white people and him. And one of the white guys sat down next to him and leaned over and said, nigger. And the colored guy looked, and the white guy said, nigger. And the colored guy got up and said, where? Where? I heard that one in the civil rights movement somewhere. I'm going to tell you later on how I was rescued by the NAACP one day. Now, I realize that that's a terrible organization, but I did get rescued one day. But first, I want to tell you how to identify a John Bircher in the audience. Now, I developed a technique. So I have to be able to identify the opposition and the friends. It's not enough to know your enemy. You got to know who your friends are. Because you might need them someday and they won't be there. This is true. Well, the way I identify Birchers is this. I have a talk I give, and in the middle of the talk, I ask a question about how many policemen and firemen were killed during the Watts riot. Well, the answer always turns out to be none because there weren't any. Killed by sniper fire. And I ask this question to the audience. I've got them all up in suspense. And I say, now, answer my question. Exactly how many policemen and firemen were killed by sniper fire during the Watts riot? Anybody know? Of course, no one ever knows. I say, anybody want to take a guess? And people start looking at each other. They're afraid to guess. Some want to guess 50, some want to guess none. They don't have any idea. I say, anybody suspicious? So usually some poor soul will say none. I said, that's right. The answer was none. You can always identify a John Bircher in the audience. That man's a John Bircher. You see, he may not know the answer, but he makes some darn good guesses. Then I tell him, turn around and look at him. He got little beady eyes. And the funny part about it is that I say he got little beady eyes, and the people turn around and look at him. You wouldn't believe what's going on out there. I had one of them beady-eyed monsters, actually a beady-eyed minister, denounce me one day. He's supposed to be a minister. I don't believe he was. But he had that collar on backwards, and I think he had his brain on backwards, too. I gave this talk, and I knew he was in the audience somewhere. You see, I got used to dealing with people. My grandmother taught me how to deal with them. See, I know there must be some hogs out there somewhere. So I throw rocks. I always throw rocks when I'm giving a talk. Now, what happened was that I had given this talk, and I had thrown these rocks, because most people were my friends, you see. The rock always hits the enemy. I'd given this talk, and people were happy, and this minister got up and said what church he was from and denounced me. You can't believe how badly he denounced me. And I responded to it, and I said to him, you know something? My grandmother always told me. She said, if you throw a rock into a pack of hogs and one of them hollers, that's the one you hit. Stop me in a hurry. I have a technique to control crowds too. Now I got all kind of devices and stuff. I don't mean switchblades either. I have a technique to control crowds. I was up in Fort Collins, Colorado. Now, you won't believe the trouble I get in. So listen. See, I was in Colorado. I'd been in Pueblo the day before, and all I had heard was how they had chased Alan Stang out right before that. The police escorted him not just out of the town, but out of the county. That's true, see? And there I am up there, poor little black me, you know, I was scared. See? So I was giving this talk, and in barged all these lefties. Matter of fact, I'll tell you what happened. The people came in first, the ordinary paying people, Negroes, whites, from everybody. The place began to fill up. I arrived at 5 minutes late. The talk began at 8 o'clock. Outside, there must have been 50, 60 gurus standing. That's them whites and Negroes with all that hair and stuff, you know, making like they're lefties or something. And they were standing there gonna make some trouble. So the guy on the door said to me, he says, "Oh my goodness, what are we gonna do?" And I looked. I said, "I'll tell you what, let all the paying customers in and then open the doors, let them in." He said, "Oh my goodness." He said, "Well, we'll run up. We'll get torn up." I said, No. I said, let them in. Let them in, because when they're inside, they listen to me. If they stay outside, they're going to break the doors down. Now, there's a lesson to be learned in that, because they came in, these Negroes and whites, and they sat around and they stood up against the wall. There was a whole gang of them. And I pulled off what I call my sudden stop. You see, it ain't the long fall that kills you, it's the sudden stop at the end. Now, what I did was I used the term Negro in the talk. Well, you know what happened. Use the term Negro, all them blacks go, "Arr!" I said, "Ooh, I got you where I want you now." So I used the term Negro again. See, I had to find a way to silence the whites and the blacks. Or should I put it this way? I mean, that left-wing combination that breaks up meetings. Now, I know that the whites will hide behind the blacks. Because while I hate to even call them, I'm going to call them blacks because them was blacks. They're not what Negroes. Some Negroes in the bunch, but I'm talking about blacks. Well, what happened there was that the blacks would react to things, you know, because they've been led to believe they're supposed to be called black. Every time I say Negro, they'd go, "Rrr, rrr." Well, I know there's some white guys in the audience, and they're waiting for a chance to disrupt the meeting. But they ain't near about as smart as I am, and they ain't near about as quick. So what happened was I used this term Negroes, the Negroes went, "Rrr." I'm looking, see, trying to find out who the leader of these whites are. Whites is, see. So I used the term again. Negroes went, "Rrr." So then I knew what they were going to do every time I used that term, see. So I built it up and built it up and built it up. And they knew I was going to use this term Negro. Well, see, I had spotted the little white guy who was going to make the trouble. I had him all pegged out. So I looked over here at the audience, you know, and I gave this long talk, you know, and blah, blah, blah. And then I used the word Negro. And all the Negroes went right through the hoop. All the blacks, rather. Rah! And when I used the term Negro, I looked right over at him. Like that. You know what he was doing? Had his hands like that. And his mouth open. He was caught. I looked at him, and I kept on looking at him, and I continued with my speech, and he turned purple. He wasn't breathing. I scared him half to death. Well, that took care of the white part of this business. Now, mind you, this combination of these whites who can hide behind the Negroes and make all the trouble. I had to find a way to get rid of those Negroes, or get rid of those so-called blacks, how to silence them. So I had noticed also that every time I made a comment, there was some great big guru against the wall making trouble. He was very vocal. As a matter of fact, he must have been 6'10". He's a great big guy, leaning up against the wall, up against the window, you know, blah, blah, blah. Every time I make a comment. So here's the sudden stop. I'm leading to the sudden stop, you see. But what happened was, there I was, and I gave about that much of a sentence, if you can measure that in time. That's pretty long. And then as soon as I stopped, he made some comment. So I let him make the comment. Then I gave him another sentence about that long. And when I stopped, he made another comment. So I gave him a sentence that long. And when I stopped, he made a comment. And after a few minutes there, I'd be saying something, then he'd say something. I'd say something, he'd say something. So pretty soon I went real fast. And that just stopped. Lo and behold, there he stood against the wall talking to himself. You won't believe this, and blah, 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 blah. And people were looking at him, and I say, hey, here, over there. Everybody in the place looked at him like that. I hate to do this to people, but I got to get even. See? And I looked over at this guy, and this has actually happened, and I said, you, shut your mouth. And you know what happened was when I pointed my finger at him like that, he went up against the wall. It's true. So that's when I suddenly stopped. And that's one of the techniques for controlling crowds. I don't advocate that you should try that because you might get in trouble. I have another technique called hypnotism. Now, I realize you don't believe that I can hypnotize a whole audience, but it's true. I have practiced hypnotism on large audiences. And, I used to just toy around with minds and things. I really did. Well, I was hypnotizing audiences, and that seemed to be a very effective way to sell literature. We were... So I told the coordinator, this same Bob Bogensberger up in the state of Washington, I told him, Bob, I says, I'm going to hypnotize the audience for you. He says, well, do me a favor, will you? Wake him up. So I thought to myself, I said, all right, I'm going to do that. So I gave this talk, and I had everything concentrated. Everybody was looking right at me. And I had them just right there where I wanted them. And I said to him, I promised the coordinator I would do this for you. I took out my watch, it was on a big long chain. And I swung it in front of them. I said, I want everybody to look at this watch. Pay attention. You learn something now. And they all were looking, and I said, watch go back and forth, back and forth. I let them watch. Then I said to them, you're waking up. You're waking up. Well, of course, to show you how literal this is, I went over to Ohio and I was telling this story. I was in a car with just a couple of characters, one on being a section leader of the John Birch Society. I was telling the same story. And this guy turned around to me and I told him, you're waking up, you're waking up. He says, you can't hypnotize anybody that way. I kind of laughed at him. And about a half a minute later, he said, Charlie, I want to ask you something. Now, this is the question which left me speechless. There have been several questions that I couldn't reply to. He turned around to me in all seriousness. He said, have you always been fearless? Now, think about it. Have you always been fearless? Well, of course I hadn't. As a matter of fact, I don't know what he's talking about. I couldn't say anything. That was about the third time I had been stopped so cold. I guess somebody got even with me at that time. So I just record those things. Well, I got caught the same way, that is, speechless. And there's nothing like a speaker who's lost his speech, except one who's lost his voice. Well, what happened, of course, was I was giving this talk, and one of these guys got up. I had nothing good to say about government. I was talking about the federal government and what happened. And we got into this big, long discussion afterwards. And one of these people got up and he said, all right, he says, the government's not to put the welfare in and not to put this program and that program. He said, what is government for? Lo and behold, I didn't even know. I knew it had something to do, but I couldn't think of what it was. Well, this happened. I stood there a minute and I said, well, I know it does something, but I can't think of it. Now, this is honesty, of course. I didn't have any answer. Well, I had to find a way to get even. So during the question and answer period, this is at a school, this was at a place where Angela Davis had spoke the day before. They had a bunch of police undercover agents there. I didn't know they were undercover agents. I thought they were white guys. They're the only ones in the crowd. They had a bunch of police undercover agents there. Angela Davis had spoken, so the police were worried about this thing. Going to be trouble. So I gave this talk. Everything went real well. And in the question and answer period, this black got up. And again, I use that term black, meaning not Negro, that one who thinks he's over there somewhere, this kind of business. This black got up and he asked me a question. I answered it. He asked another question. I answered it again. He asked a third one. I answered it. Now, there were other people with their hands up. He asked about 4 or 5 questions. And I said, wait. I said, now, I've answered your questions. Someone else has a question. He says, wait a minute. You sit back. He told the guy to sit down. See, he says, Now, he says, I have some more questions to ask. And then he gave me this great big spiel about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, the usual garbage. And he ended, he says, now, are you going to let me finish, or are you going to cut me off? I said, I'm going to cut you off. Sit down. Next question. I was even with him. Now, I tell people all the time I'm black Irish. I didn't know what that meant at first until I met a white Irish. What it is you look over your opposition, look over the audience, and you can find a way to get even with somebody. Because out there in the audience, I don't think in this audience anybody needs to be gotten even with. Do you? Well, you look over the audience. I looked over this one audience, and I thought to myself, I'm happy today. And I said, I'll tell you my background. My racial background, I am Irish, Indian, and Negro. Not necessarily in that order, not necessarily in that proportion. We never caught the Irishman, but he knew he was there somewhere. Now, I told him, I said, now, when I answer a question in the question and answer period, sometimes the answer I give depends on my racial background. See, they all thought I was a Negro, see? You know, sometimes it's advantageous to be white or an Indian. So I got that in me, see, so I can just switch the way I want to. I have never found a way to pull a Sammy Davis Jr., but I will. What happened was I gave this. You don't want me? I had to find a way to get even. This fellow got up and I gave this talk and he got up and denounced me. Now, you have to imagine a denunciation. This was a white guy got up and the biggest word he used had 3.5 letters. He was cutting them off short. He was spitting them out as fast as they could come. The audience was shocked. And he called me all kind of names and you know, just the very vile stuff. And I really was standing there taking that. So it was all over, and I said to him, I says, well, you want me to respond to that? He said, yeah, I want an answer. Well, see, he hadn't really asked a question. He had just come up with a bunch of charges and wild stuff and wanted me to respond to it. So I said, well, you know, my background, you know, I'm Irish and Indian and Negro. So this is the Indian in me talking. White man speak with forked tongue. Well, this was a white man speaking with a forked tongue, and I told him so. Actually, a lot of them speak with forked tongues. As a matter of fact, you can always tell when a communist is lying. I think most of you know how to tell. Just watch him and see if he moves his lips. The reason I mention this is because I was supposed to speak up in Northern California, and here a bunch of these so-called blacks got together, a bunch of professors got together, organized about 6 or 7 Negroes calling themselves blacks. And they organized a couple of these little faculty members called themselves blacks and stopped me from speaking. When I asked them why, they said I couldn't speak on account I was a Negro. That happened. And the funny part about it was they let the coordinator speak, who was a white man, let him speak to the group. This sort of business. Now, I need some civil rights. So I'm going to get even with them. Here's how I got even. I went to Alaska. Not to escape, but I went up on a tour. When I got to Alaska, you know, it was supposed to be cold and all. I got up and got off the plane and going to a talk that night. As I went to the talk, I looked up and there was a big picket line. And here I was with no one to help me but a woman, and I was carrying a bunch of boxes. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I'm going to get killed. So I was walking, see these picketers had these picket signs. They had baseball bats disguised as picket signs, actually. There they were outside, parading around, called me all kind of names. And I looked at them, and I was just like walking a gauntlet. You have to do this. You have to be either crazy or a John Berkshire to do this kind of thing. And I'm both. Well, I got to walking through this picket line. They shouted all kind of names at me, called me names, and said all kind of vile things and made a lot of threats. And up at the head of the picket line, up near the door, was this colored woman. She owned more land in Alaska than the federal government. But she's head of NAACP, and she's up there crying discrimination. You know, my recommendation was, she said, I can't go in this restaurant. I said, well, why don't you terminate the lease? Well, she's very rich. She's been up there 25 years and owned and monopolized the free enterprise, but she thinks she's a socialist. So what happened there was that as I walked up to the front, she says, all right, you Uncle Tom. All right. Stooge for the white folks. He called me a lot of names. I ain't going to repeat all the names, but she called me a lot of names. She says, how much of them blankety blank white people paying you to betray your people? How much? And I saw I couldn't get in the door unless I answered her. I want to know how much them John Birches are paying you to betray your own people. And I stopped in front of her and I said to her, you really want to know? She said, yeah. I said, $100,000. She said, $100,000? I said, yeah. And you know, I looked at her and the signs were coming down. Yeah. You'd have to see this to believe it. Now, like I said, that's the reason I changed when I was on the speaking tour. That used to introduce me as telling the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. That wasn't true. So I had to change a little part of it, you know. Nothing but the truth business got me. I believe that welfare is stealing by government. I may not believe that, but I believe that's what it is. Matter of fact, if one man comes to me and takes my property, uses it for his own benefit, that's called stealing. If the government takes it and gives it to him, it's still stealing, but they call it welfare. I explained this one day, and I told a young lady in a big audience why I was opposed to welfare. We're just stealing by government. I'm getting tired of the government stealing things from me. And she got up. This had to be a white liberal, but she was a misguided girl, just maybe 20 years old in college. And she got up and she said, oh, Mr. Smith, you know, I'm so terrible. You know, she got to berating me. And she ended up, she had this big, long preface to a question, and she wound up by asking me, she said, if you cut off all these programs, if you don't endorse these programs, tell me, who's going to feed the little children? Who's going to clothe them? Who's going to take care of them when they're sick? And she went on and on and on about this bleeding heart stuff. I couldn't believe it. I said, do you want me to answer that question? She says, yes. Who's going to feed the children? Who's going to clothe the children? Who's going to provide housing for them and medical care? I said, young lady, did you ever hear of mothers and fathers? No, I'll tell you, this is what you have to do, you see, because if you say you're against something, like you're against whatever, it's a forced busing, they accuse you of being against Negroes. If you're against the federal housing program, they tell you want everyone to live in slums or something, you know, that sort of business. So you got to have a stand on principle somehow, and you got to know individual responsibility will automatically reduce the size of government. What happened, of course, was at the same meeting, this another fellow got up and got to telling me about how much I hated Negroes. I think the girl was colorblind. She got up, wanted to know what I had against the Negroes. You can't believe the kind of questions I got. So I finally said to her, I said, can I answer you? She said, yes. I said, why, you know, I got nothing against Negroes. She says, you know, I'm married to one. I told her, I said, yeah, I'm one. I thought she couldn't see me or something. I said, I'm one, you know, like I'm a Negro, see? And then I answered her question. I said, and I'll tell you one more thing. I said, some of my best friends are Negroes. Well, you can imagine how that got her, you know. She didn't accuse me of being racist and all that. Well, I got to get even with somebody, so I found a way to get even with them all. Now, what I'm going to do is, Alan Stang and I are going to make up a a set of medals. We're going to make them out of sterling silver. Actually, we'll make it out of copper disguised as sterling silver. That's the Stang influence. We're going to make these medals, and I want to have a big one, about that big. See, it's going to have Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and John Kennedy, and we're going to have nice pictures of them and all. We're going to go into business selling doing this. A lot of people want those medals, and we talked it over, and so we agreed to do that. So we're going to make these medals and sell them to the lefties. What we're going to do, see, is underneath them, we'll put the names of the guys. You know how the little busts, the names? Then down the bottom will be some little scratches. And of course you can't, it's too small for the eye to see. So naturally when they get home, everybody takes a magnifying glass out and they look to see what it says. And it's going to say, these were 3 of the most vicious thugs who ever lived. Not all my ideas go over. Sometimes they're rejected. I have lots of ideas about this here. Then I had an idea for bumper stickers. And I thought for sure someone would pick it up and bring the bumper stickers here. This is the bumper sticker you see based on what I call the principle of reversal. Well, not really reversal, but putting it in gear the wrong way. See? Now all the bumper sticker is going to say is, and we need this bumper sticker really, all it's going to say is Richard Nixon, not a communist. We're going to stage some business. I like to tell you about them assassinations, how to stage things. Now, I'll tell you, you guys need instruction on how to stage things. See, we've been pulling off riots, and y'all been watching. Now, you got to find a way to stage things. Now, I'm going to tell you how to stage assassinations and how to get away with it. Okay? Now, I've always told people how to stage riots, and as you can see, we all got away with that. You still think it was spontaneous. Well, here's the way we're going to stage the assassination. Remember Martin Luther King? Now, this is the way it was done, of course. King was shot. Nobody knew who did it. Everybody turned on the television sets, and there was Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley and the whole pack. There they were describing the assassination. Martin Luther King is dead and crying crocodile tears and all that baloney. I didn't want him assassinated, but I didn't like what he was doing. King was assassinated. Everybody said, who did it? No one knew who did it. Everybody watched TV. During the shock of the moment, what you're seeing is not what you're hearing. Didn't you ever read a book and listen to music at the same time? You ever do that? All right, what you see ain't what you hear. Well, when you're watching TV, the visual picture and the audio picture are two different things. The visual picture becomes part of the conscious mind. The audio picture becomes part of the subconscious mind. Now, I want you all to picture what happened to you. There you were sitting in front of TV. Who killed King? Everybody had the TV sets on. And it was Huntley and Brinkley showing the scene and the tragedy and whatever they could, And what were they saying? We don't know who killed Martin Luther King, but we know this much. It was a white man. And he was dressed in a white suit. He ran outside and jumped into a white Ford Mustang and was last seen headed for the deepest part of the white South. Even the rifle was white. I think they were going to say he used a silver bullet. Silver being the white metal, but they didn't want to disillusion anybody. Well, of course, the message was white racism killed Martin Luther King. Now, you think about that a moment, and I ask you why you put up with that sort of nonsense. Why? Why? Why on God's earth won't you use the brain that God gave you? Why? And people walking around to my white racism. Now, I'll tell you another staging. Of course, you can see the staging if you just get a little thinking. The assassination, of course, changed the enemy from ghetto conditions to white racism, if you listen to, you understand the civil rights movement. But to go a little further here, to show you another staging, and I insist, and I still insist, that highways are part of the communist conspiracy. Y'all don't believe me, do you? All right, in this country, back in 1966 thereabouts, we had, 4 or 5 million miles of highway and secondary roads. All over the country. Well, there was lots of white people, lots of Negroes. But there was one white man who was different than all the rest. You see, this white man had a shotgun. A lot of white people have shotguns. This one had a shotgun, but he was out standing on a highway because there's so many miles of roads. See, he had crossed the highway. And lo and behold, there's lots of bushes going around there, and this guy was hiding in some bushes right beside one of these highways. Now, don't get me wrong. He didn't even know the highway was there. He wasn't expecting nothing. I think he was hunting birds. Maybe shooting crows or something, big black birds. Or something. There he was, hiding down the highway. Now, at that same time, on that same day, on one of these 5 million miles of highway, there was a television camera and a crew. Now, I don't know what the camera and the crew were doing there. It's just coincidence. Now, don't get me wrong. You see, he was in them bushes, and so he couldn't see that camera, and that camera couldn't see him on this 5 million miles of highway, in the same place at the same time. Well, you see, there's one Negro in this country who thought he was in slavery. And being as how he was in slavery, he had to walk to freedom. He walked, didn't run. He had to walk to freedom. And believe it or not, this Negro was walking on that highway. Out of all these 5 million miles of highway, he chose that one to walk on. And by just some sheer accident, he walked right in front of that television camera. And by just a stroke of luck, that white man in the bushes shot him. Negro fell on the ground, and then the white man, after he shot him, Negro fell on the ground, the white man opened up the bush and stuck his head out, and the camera got all the pictures. Now, don't get me wrong, this was all an accident. Of course, I'm referring to that James Meredith incident. The thing was staged. As a matter of fact, all of you men in this audience, and most of the women here, who know anything about hunting, know good and well that thing was staged. You see, the way I figured it was like this. James Meredith was shot with a half dove load. Now, you know something about hunting? When you go hunting, it takes a full dove load to kill a little white bird, and this man shot a big black bird with a half dove load. Sure, the thing was staged all the way. But of course, I didn't find anybody who knew that. There was a shock of the moment, and of course, everybody was a white racist and all that stuff, including me, for saying it happened. Well, these are the stagings, of course. I also have a way of getting rid of opposition in audiences. Now, mind you, all this business I tell people, this is during the course of talks and lectures and things. These are all things that I've told people at various times to neutralize opposition, to win friends, to influence people. And you should begin to use the same kind of things, and don't be afraid. You got nothing to lose. You don't. Might get beat up. Might get a few lumps, but try it anyway. Now, I had an audience one day, and in that audience, I didn't feel like going through this, my sudden stop, anything, but in that audience, there's some white guys and some Negroes, and there they sat, and I knew they were going to make trouble. And I looked over there, and I said, oh, that's just trouble. So I started my talk, and then I stopped, and I said, now, wait a minute. Now, I want to say something here that only has meaning for blacks. So I had to use the term black so they'd identify with me. Just for us black folks. Then I started talking in our language, and I said to the Negroes over there, I said, now look, you don't have to believe me when I say they're going to make a race war in this country. You don't have to believe me. Just remember one thing, though. I want you to keep this in mind all during the talk. If the communists are successful in bringing about a race war, you just remember that all them white boys got to do when the shooting starts is shave off them beards, take a bath, get in suits, and disappear right back into them communities where they came from. But you can't change the color of your skin. So you better take a good look at them before you ever get involved. But you know what happens? Them Negroes look over at them white guys. Let me get through a few more before Mrs. McKinney throws me off the stage. Have to get even? Have to get even with her. I'll tell you about the witch hunt. I was on a radio show one day, and here come this guy calling up, and he said to me, he says, "You sound like this McCarthyism stuff. This is a witch hunt." Well, you know, how do you answer the charge of a witch hunt? He wanted all the listeners to call and accuse me of being some kind of right-winger, maybe even a John Bircher. Anyway, I said to the man, I said, "Let me ask you a question for you." I said, "First of all, this is not a witch hunt." I said, "The reason for it is, everybody knows that witches don't exist." I said, "We ain't looking for witches. We're looking for communists." I said, "And we ain't looking under beds either, because the communists don't hide under beds. We're looking for communists, and we're looking for communists in the only place where they go, in government. You better look too." As an afterthought, I said to him, "And besides, buddy, you got nothing to fear from a witch hunt, unless you happen to be a witch." People heard that I was married. You know, the word passed around amongst the John Birchers, so I attended a meeting a big meeting. It was a theater party. I was the only Negro there but my wife. My wife and I were only Negroes. There weren't a lot of Negroes there. I was standing there, and some guy come up to me and says, "Charlie Smith, good to meet you." And we shook hands. He says, "That woman over there," he says, "I presume that that's your wife?" And I said, "Yeah, this is a mixed marriage." Bob Lehman said, "Which one of you guys is Jewish?" Now, speaking of that, let me get to Governor Wallace. I don't want to get even with him because he ain't done nothing yet. But speaking of that, I spoke for Governor Wallace back in 1968 during the presidential campaign. Believe it or not, I spoke for Governor Wallace at Beverly Hills High School. Now, Beverly Hills High School, of course, is in the middle of the... It's in the middle of the Jewish community, and people always think that the Jews are super liberals. It's not true. What you have is 4 or 5 guys leading the rest of them and stampede them a little bit. But what they had done at this high school was they had what they call Political Affairs Week, a different speaker every day of the week. And the last guy to speak was going to be the Wallace speaker. Well, the Wallace people were scared half to death. They knew what was going to happen, so they called me, Fearless Charlie. And I thought the whole thing over, and it seemed like there was a nice little joke in that business. So I agreed to go out and speak for Governor Wallace. Now, what happened at the high school, to show you how this business worked, they were going to make a riot. The Cranston person, Cranston is a senator now, Alan Cranston, spoke the first night. They booed him down. The Nixon guy spoke the second night. He couldn't even finish his speech. They chased out the Rafferty guy, the guy from Max Rafferty, and the fourth guy was Paul Jacobs. Paul Jacobs is a communist working in the Ford Foundation. They wouldn't even let him speak. Well, by Friday, the whole thing was up to a fever pitch. You know, here comes this Wallace guy. See? So I showed up at this high school, and I got there a little bit early, see? Now, I ain't about to get my head bashed in. I showed up a little bit early, and there sat this guy named Stern. He was from the Stern, you know, the Stern family. There he was, sitting there about 17 years old, and I looked at him, and then there was a guy sitting next to him, and looked around the audience. I knew what was going to happen, you see. He had his buddies, about 10 little buddies, and they were going to station themselves throughout the audience. And then when I began my talk, then these guys were going to start heckling and making trouble, and it would seem like it was everybody. And pretty soon the whole place would be in an uproar. They're going to make a big riot. So I figured that the leader of the pack was up there safe with me. So I turned to this guy and I said, "Look," I said, "I'm going to tell you something right now, buddy. If anything happens here, anything at all, if there's any trouble, you know what's going to happen? I'm going to pick you up, I'm going to break both your arms and throw you right off the stage." So you understand? Well, he got a little bit scared. And I said, "That's right, both arms and both legs. And off the stage. You understand that?" I said, "You stop him. You understand? Stop him." So I said, this is way before the crowd came in, see? Then I'm sitting there waiting. Came time for him to introduce me. He got up before the mic, His little buddies, 10 little buddies were out there somewhere. He got up, he says, please, oh, please, please. Make it. Please don't make any trouble. Everybody's about to be here. Don't make any trouble. Please, please, please. Of all the speakers who showed up, I was the only one allowed to finish the speech. I got a standing ovation. When I left, my buddy and I walked by the printing shop, and there they were over there destroying the papers they had already printed about this big riot. Let me move on and get to the finish. I got my preferences. I'm always asked a lot of questions, so let me ask you a question right now. I have an idea of getting out of the United Nations. Now, let me ask you a question. How many of you people are in favor of limiting the president's power to make war? Raise your hands. How many of you are in favor of limiting the president's power to make war? Raise your hands. Woo, boy. Yeah, man. Let me ask you a second question. How many of you guys are in favor of limiting the amount of money a bank teller can legally steal? Now, wait a minute. Now, you ought not have your hands up because a bank teller legally can't steal any money. Well, the point I'm making, of course, is these people shouting about they're going to curb the president's power, limit his power to make war, or granting him power to make war, because it says in the Constitution Congress shall have the power to declare war. That's subversion. Look, if I were a liberal, I could have had me a whole lot of allies, couldn't I? Sure, there's be suckers in the Congress. What they've done is they've subverted the Constitution with the UN Charter. Most of you know that. So let's say get out of the United Nations. I have an idea how to do it. This is a solution, of course. Now, there are two ways. You can join the John Birch Society, get organized, and fight hard. And harder. And even harder than that. And the job will get done. Carry out the Birch program. You can do that. I got to get through here right quick. Who do I want for president? I'm forever asked this on the road. Well, back during the thick of the political campaign, people always get up and say, who do you want for the presidency? I said, well, I am in favor of Edmund Muskie for the presidency. And they'd go, or North Vietnam. Then I would tell them, Richard Nixon ought to be president of Communist China. Lastly, I think George McGovern ought to be queen. And to get even with Frank Capel for making this a gloom and doom society, I think he ought to be president of the gloom and doom society. I asked an audience one day, I gave them a talk, and they were agreeing with me, and I said, all right, who would you want to have a president? Me or Edward Kennedy? They said, you. I said, all right, let me ask one more question. Would you want your daughter to marry Kennedy? Well, there's some stuff I have to leave off here because time's running short. Let me get to the last part. My mother, this happened to my mother. My mother heard that I was down south, that I'd been with George Wallace. You know, the picture was in the newspaper. And she called me up and told me to be careful. Be careful of messing with that man. No, so I told her, yeah, Mom, okay. I haven't talked to her in 20 years, but, I mean, because she's a good influence morally, but her judgment ain't too good about this business. She said, be careful of that man Wallace. You got to, well, what do you think you're doing? I said, I'll be all right, Mom, don't worry. Well, believe it or not, 2 weeks later, my sister came in and told her that I was down south raising Cain. My mother said, my God, Wallace put him back in slavery. Now for my second big announcement. I had two big announcements, one at the beginning, one at the end. This big announcement is this. George Wallace, Governor Wallace, asked me to run for the vice presidency with him. Now I wrote it. And I said to him, I says, well, I'll do it, but what's in it for me? I said, what happens if we win? What do I get? He said, Charlie, my boy, he says, you can have a concession on the sheets. We'll be through in a minute or so, right? So instead of Wallace, I went to see Lester Maddox. See, Lester Maddox is thinking of running too. He told me, he said, I'll run if George Wallace doesn't. Somebody has to get in fight for America. And I said, well, you're going to need a vice presidential mate, aren't you? He said, yes, Charlie, he said, I think you do fine with me. He said, run with me. And I said, well, I'll do it. You know, I like Governor Maddox. I said, but what happens if we win? What's in it for me? He said, Charlie, he says, you can manufacture all the axe handles. Well, I decided to stick with the John Birch Society because I made a secret deal with Robert Welch. When this fight's all over, I am going to be the only manufacturer of lampposts. To make it crystal clear, and my wife's a real patriot, my wife anticipates the victory which is coming to us, and she's sitting home right now making rope. That's real dedicated. Alan, let me call you back up here. I need Alan for this, and we'll close with this. Let me tell you all right now that Gary Allen's going to be signing autographs over there between 5 and 6. So all you guys go over there and get his book and read it and use it as a rock to throw at liberals. Now, I got Alan Stang stand here for a reason. And the reason for it is, Alan, I want to tell you right now that you are a friend of mine. I am happy to be on your side. And I think we should all get together and win this fight as soon as we can. Now, the reason I want to win this fight is because as soon as it's over, I am going back to my old job. I had a good job before I got in this fight.
Well, Charles, what was your original job?
Beating up white people. Thank you. You can have it, Mr. McKinney. I wouldn't beat you up, no. I got one chair over there. Come sit over here.